Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's event, launch of Hong Kong Watch's new report by Anouk Ware, In the Name of National Security, How Hong Kong's National Security Laws Dismantle the Rule of Law in Comparative Perspective. I'm Shelley Han, Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, which devises allied solutions to the global challenges posed by China's rise, and both leverages and amplifies the Atlantic Council's work on China across its 16 programs and centers. In 2020, the PRC imposed Hong Kong national security law on the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. 4 years later, in 2024, the Hong Kong SAR enacted its own security legislation, the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance. This new report offers an in-depth analysis of the rule of law in Hong Kong, drawing comparisons with the PRC, Russia, and Malaysia. It examines the rankings, institutional similarities, and differences in the rule of law across these jurisdictions. The report contends that the implementation of these security laws has led the Hong Kong SAR to breach its international legal obligations and curtail the freedoms of Hong Kong residents to an unprecedented level. This report's publication is especially timely, coinciding with crucial developments in Hong Kong's legal landscape. Just earlier today in Hong Kong, 3 government-appointed national security judges have sentenced 45 opposition politicians and activists between 4 to 10 years in prison for committing themselves to fighting for greater democratic rights for the city. The severe sentences will further erode Hong Kong's once thriving pro-democracy movement, significantly impacting the political climate of this global financial hub. Today, we're lucky to have the report author Anouk Ware, as well as a group of expert panelists here to discuss their reactions to the report and Hong Kong's legal landscape. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Associate Director of the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, Matt Girassi. Over to you, Matt.
Thanks so much, Shelley, and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Matt Girassi, Associate Director with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce the report's author, Anouk Ware, as well as our 3 panelists. Anouk Ware is a research and policy advisor at Hong Kong Watch, based in Washington, D.C. She is from Hong Kong and the US and previously worked on labor rights and Uyghur rights in the China region. We're also joined by Thomas Kellogg, who is Executive Director of the Center for Asian Law, where he oversees various programs related to law and governance in Asia. He is a leading scholar of legal reform in China, Chinese constitutionalism, and civil society movements in China. We're also joined by Sophie Richardson, who is a longtime activist and scholar of Chinese politics, human rights, and foreign policy. From 2006 to 2023, she served as the China Director at Human Rights Watch, where she oversaw the organization's research and advocacy. As a visiting scholar at Stanford University's FSI Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, her current research focuses on the global implications of democracy's weak responses to increasingly repressive Chinese governments, and she is also advising several China-focused human rights organizations. And finally, we also are joined by Kevin Yam, who is a member of China Strategic Risk Institute's advisory board. He had nearly 2 decades of experience as a Hong Kong lawyer who worked in international firms, specializing in the commercial and financial sector disputes and regulatory investigations. Currently, he is a PhD candidate at Australia's Melbourne Law School, working on a thesis about the impact of China's authoritarian encroachments on Hong Kong as an international financial center. And he is a research fellow at Melbourne Law School Center for Comparative Constitutional Studies as well as a non-resident senior fellow at the Georgetown Center for Asian Law. So Anouk, this has been an incredible report. I really had a great job reading it, so I'd love to give you an opportunity to quickly summarize its key themes and ideas. So Anouk, over to you.
Thank you so much, Matt, for the introduction and moderation, and thank you so much to my panelists for being here today, and also thank you to Shelley and the Atlantic Council for hosting us. I'm going to give a couple of really brief remarks about the report, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the panel. So the report came about after a series of conversations about the rule of law in Hong Kong. We've noticed the decline in a lot of our work, and at the same time, we've seen how the Hong Kong government continues to promote business as usual. They had a legal week 2 weeks ago, and they continue to tout that the Hong Kong legal environment is in compliance with international law, their own law, and so it's become increasingly frustrating to see this, and we really wanted to write something to analyze why the rule of law is not normal, and to unpack this in a way that is accessible and also comparative so that people can understand what the Hong Kong rule of law looks like in relation to other jurisdictions which are known for having very poor rule of law. And so that's what the report does. In Hong Kong, specifically, we analyzed how post the 2019 protest in particular, and the crackdown on human rights, since then, the 2020 National Security Law was introduced, and then the 2024 Safeguarding National Security Ordinance was introduced, and there is a wealth of excellent analysis on the impacts of these laws, which I can't summarize in the next 2 minutes, but the laws essentially, to take 2 key points. Firstly, the laws define national security in an overly broad and ambiguous way, so that essentially anything that the government dislikes can be deemed a national security threat or violation, and the definition of national security in these laws comes from a PRC ideology, and it is always interpreted by government officials in Hong Kong who can decide whether something is a national security threat or not. And then following from that, there's a number of procedures which apply to national security cases in particular, which include a high degree of opacity, special appointed judges, a lack of jury. And so very quickly, something that the government doesn't like can be prosecuted in a very opaque and unfair way. And then on top of that, and as referenced in the definition of national security, the institutions in Hong Kong have been blurred. But the institutions that are political now have a say in the legal institutions. For example, judges can be appointed. For example, national security is defined by the chief executive, not a judge. And so increasingly, there is a deterioration of the independence of the judiciary, which is another threat to the rule of law in Hong Kong. And I think my panelists will discuss this in more detail, and the report gives many specific examples, but I think these are 2 main themes which we've seen in the violation of the rule of law in Hong Kong. Firstly, in the definition and the interpretation of the terms, and secondly, the erosion of the boundaries between institutions and the erosion of judicial independence in Hong Kong. I think for a lot of the Hong Kong government says that they've said many times in different ways that this only affects a small number of terrorists, and that this doesn't affect normal people, and that actually Hong Kong is safer than ever before. And while this is these are very attractive claims, they're not true at all. And the report unpacks that with a lot of examples. But I think more generally, when the government has the ability to pick which things are national security violations and then treat them in a completely different way, no one is safe from this. And I think, as we've seen in mainland China, it is very risky to bifurcate the national security and political legal space from the rest of the legal space and claim that the rule of law and the legal environment remains as normal or better when one part of it is rapidly and seriously degrading. And so I think for a lot of businesses in Hong Kong, maybe you do not face these risks at the moment, but there's always this possibility. In my head, I see it like a little black hole, like in the universe where, maybe you don't touch it and maybe it doesn't affect you. But if for some chance your institution or your activity is deemed a national security violation, you're suddenly going to fall in, and all of these safeguards will no longer be in place. The interpretations are not fair. And I think even though that's a very small risk, for many, it's a very high risk. And so I think that's a very important consideration. And it looks like in Hong Kong, with the trial sentencing today, but many other developments, these risks affect a wide range of different actors. And I would say nobody is immune from the grip of the Hong Kong national security law and the Hong Kong government's use of that for their own interests. And so to very quickly compare that to a couple of other jurisdictions, I think when looking at the rule of law in mainland China, which has been known for a long time as being very poor and being a very risky legal environment, Hong Kong has increasing similarities with the mainland. This comes from the mainland actually increasing their grip in Hong Kong by putting mainland approved people in positions of power in Hong Kong, in positions of legal authority, but also in how the mainland has transplanted some of their definitions, some of their institutional structures onto Hong Kong. And increasingly, we need to treat Hong Kong as having the same rule of law risk as we understand the mainland to have. And then in a similar way, we see how the rule of law in Russia is also similar to that of Hong Kong's. I think it comes from Russia and the PRC having similar historical and institutional ideology. And it's Hong Kong's rule of law looks like China's, and therefore it looks more like Russia's. It's not that Russia necessarily has an influence on Hong Kong, though we have seen as a separate issue the Russian companies' use of Hong Kong as a hub for sanctions evasions following the February 2020 invasion of Ukraine. But I think in Russia, one thing that was particularly interesting, in addition to the institutional similarities, was how the terrorism laws are used against protesters. We've seen, I think, how egregiously the Russian government has used terrorism laws to imprison people who have criticized the invasion of Ukraine. And they have defined terrorism in really broad ways. They have a number of safeguards removed because it's such a high threat. They can interpret terrorism in a way that is opaque. And the Hong Kong government uses national security, which includes terrorism, in a way that is similarly broad and unfair. And so in making that comparison, I would urge for people to see how Hong Kong might face the same business and rule of law risks as one does in Russia. And then finally, we compared the rule of law in Hong Kong to that in Malaysia. And this was because Malaysia also has a common law system and also because they have a sedition law. And whilst Malaysia ranks lower than Hong Kong in the rule of law index, Malaysia actually has more safeguards and a more vibrant civil society than Hong Kong does. And there is a degree of dialogue between civil society and the government. And we see that is rapidly eroding in Hong Kong. So I think that shows that where Hong Kong could be taking steps to use its sedition law in very, very cautious ways or engage it with civil society more, they're actively dismantling that. and eroding the rule of law. And so to very quickly summarize, Hong Kong's rule of law is rapidly eroding in institutional ways, in how the definitions increasingly look like the definitions in China. It is in particular looking more like the rule of law in China, and we forecast that the legal environment in Hong Kong will look more and more like China's, and therefore the risks will look more and more like the risks that are faced in engaging with the rule of law in China. And so we urge governments and international businesses to call governments to call Hong Kong out for their violations of international law and to engage on these terms where the erosion is noted and not considered something normal. We've seen a large number of statements today from governments criticizing and condemning the sentencing of the Hong Kong 47, and we would urge governments to follow that up with real action and real accountability mechanisms, and not just calling the Hong Kong government out and then engaging as normal, so that they really do face a consequence for their violations of the rule of law and human rights violations in general. And then we think the governments can be advising their citizens in a more realistic way. The US issued a business advisory on Hong Kong, which was updated this summer, and we find that helpful, and we would urge other governments to do the same. And finally, for businesses and individuals who interact with Hong Kong, that they also consider the risks that are increasing, and that they do not just believe what the Hong Kong government says, and they take real measures when engaging with Hong Kong. I think that's all from me from now, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Anouk, and it was truly a pleasure to be able to read this report, and congratulations again. Truly great. So I'd love to dive right in. First, I'd love to hear from our three panelists. So Tom, why don't we start with you? I'd love to just hear your take on how the findings of this report either intersect or overlap with some of the work that you have done at the Georgetown Center for Asian Law over the past several years that's been looking at these issues, both in terms of rule of law and in human rights within Hong Kong. So Tom, really interested in hearing what you have to say on this.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for bringing us all together, and congratulations again to Anouk for this fantastic and wide-ranging report. I think it's one of the few comparative studies that really tries to tease out the commonalities between what's happening in Hong Kong and a number of different jurisdictions. And I certainly learned a lot from it, and I hope your audience members will have a chance to dive into it after the panel discussion. I also hope, obviously, we're talking on the day that the sentences came down for the Hong Kong 47, and I hope during the Q&A we'll have a chance to dive into that travesty during the Q&A discussion, because I do think it's very much related to some of the trends that Anouk highlights in her report. If I can, I want to take the conversation in a slightly different direction, because I think a slightly different comparative direction, because I think Anouk really nailed the conversation about some of these broader trends in terms of where Hong Kong is going. And I want to talk a little bit about both the Hong Kong government and the Hong Kong court's use of UK, Australian, and other common law, both case law and legislation, as a means to justify some of the trends that Anouk was documenting in her report. Now, what do I mean by that? So perhaps not surprisingly, Hong Kong doesn't want to be compared to the Russian Federation, right, in terms of the trends in its legal system. So it continues to make regular citation to the laws of other jurisdictions, and the courts are continuing to make regular citation to comparative case law from the UK and elsewhere. Now, the sad thing is that, of course, this body of case law and legislation used to be a positive influence on Hong Kong, right? As Kevin knows better than anyone, the kind of common law ties between Hong Kong and other common law jurisdictions served as a resource for the Hong Kong courts to really guard against illiberal trends and guard against the weaponization of the law to crack down on human rights. Let me give a couple of quick examples, if I can, of the way in which the Hong Kong government and the courts have been using comparative law to put a false kind of positive gloss over the weaponization of the law in the national security era. First, the Safeguarding National Security Ordinance, right? Kevin and I also worked on this together in terms of with the government's Article 23 consultation document, repeated reference to UK, Australia, New Zealand, and even US laws to sort of say, see, this is exactly what other countries are doing. And certainly no one on this panel is going to say that the laws of these other countries are perfect. But there are institutional safeguards in place to at least try to guard against abuse that just simply aren't there in the Hong Kong context right now. Of course, first and foremost, democratic elections, right? If you have a democratically elected legislature and head of state, hopefully those elected officials are going to be sensitive to human rights concerns that are being voiced by members of the media, the public, civil society organizations, and be on guard when the government is weaponizing the law to crack down on human rights. Of course, that's not the case in Hong Kong, with an appointed chief executive and a now completely undemocratic legislative council. Another example that is the focus of a forthcoming report from the Center for Asian Law here at Georgetown is the Glory to Hong Kong injunction controversy. Of course, many in your audience are aware of this snafu that happened where at different rugby matches and weightlifting contests around the world, that when Hong Kongers would do particularly well and maybe win a medal, the wrong anthem would be played, and the pro-democracy 2019 Glory to Hong Kong anthem would be played rather than the Mainland China March of the Volunteers anthem. If you read through the two decisions that were issued, two judicial decisions issued in that case, they're rife with comparative case law. And the first one actually denies the government the injunction that they sought. And that's an example of how the Hong Kong courts have tried to use comparative case law to block the government from using the law to, in this case, limit free speech. Lo and behold, the government appeals, and the Court of Appeal uses a similar body of comparative case law to justify the issuing of an injunction that then leads to both online and other forms of censorship of the Glory to Hong Kong anthem. I'm sorry to say that I think we're going to see more examples of this kind of weaponization of UK and other common law case law and legislation from other liberal jurisdiction in the years to come, as we see some of the trends documented in Anouk's report play out. And let me just conclude by asking the question, well, what can and should the Hong Kong courts be doing? Right, they've issued a blank check to the Hong Kong government over the past 5 years. We have almost, I now have to say, 99% guilty verdicts returned against national security defendants, with the two Hong Kong 47 defendants who were declared not guilty. That's an atrocious record, right? And so the Hong Kong courts, no doubt, are under extreme pressure to deliver guilty verdicts and to deliver the kind of heavy sentences that we saw against the Hong Kong 47 today. But they have to figure it out, right? They have to find a way within the very constricted political space that they're operating in to turn the page and to push back on the government's efforts to continue the crackdown into a 6th and 7th and 8th year. And I hope that this report and the conversation that we're having today will continue to shed light on what's happening in Hong Kong so that that conversation in Hong Kong can move forward. Thanks a lot, and congrats again to Anouk.
Thanks so much, Tom. That was a really, really interesting take, looking at this from the perspective of the comparative case laws in the UK and other areas. But next, I want to turn to Sophie. Of course, looking at this purely from the legal aspect, you can sometimes forget there's, of course, the human element. These are human beings that are impacted by all of these ongoing trends. And Sophie, drawing on your career in this space, in the human rights space, I'd love to hear your take. Again, drawing from the legal aspect, but kind of bringing it down back to humanity, and also your assessment on the global response to these trends as well.
Sure, Matt. Thanks. And first of all, thanks for having me. And congratulations. It's a great report. And I hope the comparison of the Hong Kong legal system to Russia's hurts in all the right ways. That I think points towards I think a lot of the kinds of problems that we're all concerned about. Matt, somebody asked me a couple of hours ago, about the verdict today. Tom already stole my adjective of travesty, or it's a noun. Sorry, Mom. Somebody said to me, well, at least Benny Tai didn't get a life sentence. To which I had to say back, it's true that that's a relief, but let's recall, he's 60 and a 10-year sentence is a long time. And, among the institutions that don't function or in closer compliance with international law as they used to in Hong Kong are prisons. We've long known that people don't go to prison in China hoping to have decent access to healthcare or decent food. I think that's increasingly the case in Hong Kong, which is another indicator of just how much the situation has deteriorated. We could probably maybe disagree a little bit about this. I wouldn't mind living in a world in which the people who were sentenced today are actually in positions of authority. These are people who have devoted their lives and their careers to upholding the rule of law, to inclusive political participation, to respect for free speech. The idea that anybody is going to prison for participating in an informal primary is ludicrous. And listening to Anouk's introduction, I found myself thinking back to the imposition and the revisions in the mainland to the state secrets law and the uses of terrorism and subversion charges to, silence hundreds and hundreds of human rights defenders, from people like Liu Xiaobo all the way through to people like, lawyers like Wang Yu. As we speak, one of China's leading human rights activists, legal minds, pro-democracy thinkers, Xu Zhiyong, is on a hunger strike in prison. He is wrongfully detained on ridiculous charges, that have been twisted as the man did nothing but actually exercise rights guaranteed to him under Chinese and international law. And he's on a hunger strike because even his rights as a prisoner are not being respected. This is the world we live in. Xi Jinping is responsible both for Xu Zhiyong's sentence and for Benny Tai's, is off, presenting himself as a leading defender of human rights and democracy at high-profile international summits. And I think one of the core realities is that he and other senior Chinese government and Hong Kong government officials pay no price for inflicting these abuses on people. And it's encouraging, Matt, to read statements from governments decrying these outcomes. Frankly, they're the same statements that governments have been issuing for 30 years in lieu of actually taking more consequential steps. And I think that's what has to change if we expect to see a change in behavior from Beijing or Hong Kong authorities. And maybe just the last point that I'll make right now, Anouk, a particular point of appreciation about the report is that it does make reference to the fact that Hong Kong is still a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, both of which set out very strong protections to which Hong Kong authorities are meant to fulfill, to things like free speech and political participation. And I hope that we can, perhaps in the discussion, talk a little bit more about what more consequential and appropriate responses are from governments that have the power and the capacity and the resources to respond in ways that are even a fraction as courageous as some of the people who've been sentenced today, like Gwyneth Ho and Joshua Wong. We owe them. We owe those people. They're out there trying to do the things that our governments say they want, and paying an enormous price for it. So maybe I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie. And we absolutely want to dig into the implications of the sentencing of the 45 of the Hong Kong 47 that we learned about earlier today. But before we dig into that component, there is one other area, of course. Amid all of these difficulties, there's also the international business component. Hong Kong, for many years, has been seen as a global financial hub. And actually, back in spring of 2023, the Atlantic Council released a report with Rhodium Group titled Fractured Foundations, Assessing Risks to Hong Kong's Business Environment, which analyzed in detail the risks to the commercial operating environment in Hong Kong that had emerged since 2020, since the 2020 introduction of the national security law. Of course, this was published in 2023, which was before the SNSO, which came out earlier this year. So no doubt there's growing trends since then as well. But this report, it looked at the currency risks, compliance challenges, and threats to judicial independence, access to accurate information, and data security. And some of the starker trends that were revealed just in the early years of the NSL are the rapid decline of foreign lawyers living in Hong Kong, as well as a rapid reduction in the number of regional headquarters of foreign businesses in Hong Kong. So Kevin, I'd love to turn to you, to assess these trends, particularly since the introduction of the SNSO. And from your perspective, where does this leave the future of Hong Kong as a global business and financial center, as well from a legal perspective as well, given your own background?
Thank you very much, Matt. And first of all, I would like to join Tom and Sophie in congratulating Anouk on a very insightful and interesting report. It's now around sort of 1:35 a.m. 20th of November in Melbourne, where I am now. Before we started this session, I was joking with the other panelists that the last time I stayed up this late for a US session was for a Congressional Executive Committee on China hearing where I testified. And for my troubles, I ended up having a bounty put over my head by the Hong Kong government, about $150,000. But yeah, I guess it's too far for your US audiences to come and nab me, but we'll see. Look, the point about the NSL, and you often hear the business sector or the commercial legal sector say, well, look, everything is fine. We know that it's a bit bad for human rights activists and the like, but everything else is actually okay. Now, look, don't take it from me. take it from an eminent jurist like Lord Sumption, who recently resigned from the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong. He actually said the rule of law is indivisible. And I think that's a very important point to start with, because even if on the surface a lot of day-to-day rulings look like they're not affected by quote-unquote political considerations, the national security law is actually having quite a lot of downstream impact on commercial law, on business, and the like. So if we think about the reality that the national security law has created such uncertainty in Hong Kong's legal environment that even pro-Beijing lawyers and legislators have admitted the Hong Kong judiciary has been having a lot of trouble in recruiting judges, let alone good caliber judges. Now, that obviously is already having an impact on significant delays in commercial litigation. And they've tried to appoint more judges to the commercial courts, but they brought in a bunch of criminal lawyers who are hearing national security cases to try and do that. So it's not the right expertise. And so on that front, you've already got a problem. And then that's also having a problem on an impact on sort of the quality of commercial justice that you're getting. I mean, if you're having a real shortage of quality candidates joining the bench, if you're having criminal judges trying to masquerade as commercial judges, that's not the sort of commercial judges that the commercial parties and business parties want. Then you've got the problem of lawyers. You've talked already about the drop in the number of foreign lawyers in recent years. And in fact, the growth in the number of local lawyers has been very slow as well. And that is a reflection of a quieter legal market. I mean, it's one of those unusual situations because typically in the commercial legal market, if deal making's not doing well, then litigation's doing well and vice versa. But at the moment, both sides are not doing so well. I've talked about some of the problems on the litigation side. On the deal making side, on the banking contract side of things, I often hear from bank in-house counsel saying that, look, whatever we ourselves think about Hong Kong law as a viable or non-viable jurisdiction, our headquarters are having concerns about what's going to happen in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, because the reality is if you enter into a contract today, then disputes are going to happen in 3, 5, 10 years' time. And even those Hong Kong in-house lawyers who are themselves optimistic or do not think there's a major problem right now are not going to risk sticking their necks out and saying to their headquarters in Zurich, in London, in New York and the like, and say everything's going to be okay in 5 years' time or 10 years' time when these contracts need to be litigated over. And so it became easier for them to say, fine, 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 you move everything to London, to New York, to Singapore and the like when it comes to choice of law or choice of jurisdiction. So you can see with all of that, whilst the national security law might on the surface not be having a direct impact on the laws themselves, it's actually having more of a downstream impact. And even on the regulation side, I mean, we've already seen, for example, sort of the vibes of the national security law having an impact. So within the last year and a half, we've had the Chinese securities regulator saying that any Chinese companies that want to list outside of mainland China, including Hong Kong, their prospectuses are not allowed to contain any disclosures which they say disparages the Chinese legal system. Now, that obviously brings into question investors' confidence in prospectus disclosures in Hong Kong listings. So that's not to say that that's a national security law issue, but the vibe itself is already having an impact in all sorts of areas. Now, turning to the question of international headquarters. Now, I know that there's been a lot of talk in recent days about captains of industry and finance converging in Hong Kong, holding a finance summit with a number of US sanctioned Hong Kong government officials and to create the impression that everything is fine. Well, the reality is not really quite that, because one of the things that a lot of these foreign bankers have become very good at is to learn from mainland Chinese business people and Hong Kong business people, which is they're very good at talking the good talk and saying all the right things in Hong Kong. But if you look at what they're actually doing with their businesses, just as Hong Kong property tycoons who wax lyrical about the national security law are now refusing to buy Hong Kong government land to develop because they have no confidence in Hong Kong's future. The banks are also quietly cutting numbers, right? They're quietly moving their operations to other parts of the world. And on that, the reality is this, that if we look at the areas of finance that Hong Kong has traditionally been strong at, things like capital markets listings, things like product launches and deal making, those sorts of things are very much dependent on informational transparency. And once you have something like a national security law and also the safeguarding national security ordinance, which creates new offenses related to state secrets. And for those of you in America, you would know that state secrets has been a real problem for auditors in terms of big accounting firms being caught between the US and China in terms of audit transparency issues. Now, the problem for Hong Kong is this: once it loses its freedoms, all that's left of Hong Kong is that it's a very expensive city to operate in, even after the economic doldrums that it's currently suffering from. Even after rents have gone down with offices, it's still more expensive than most of the world. And so either Hong Kong's got to regain its freedoms or it's got to become a lot cheaper to be competitive again. And at the moment, it looks like they're going down the cheap path. So, and with that, I think I'll end there for now. Like others, I've got plenty to say about the Hong Kong 47 case, but we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kevin. And on that note, everyone is, I guess, unfortunately, I should say, eager to discuss the results of the sentencing. It's certainly not a pleasurable issue to discuss, and I'm sure everyone's heart goes out to everyone who's affected by this. But moving to that topic, because I do want to address it. So just as a quick recap, earlier today, 45 of the 47 pro-democracy leaders, known as the Hong Kong 47, had sentences issued ranging from 4 years and 2 months to up to 10 years. They were charged with conspiracy to commit subversion under the national security law for their participation in an unofficial primary election that was held in July of 2020, just weeks after the NSL went into effect. So I'd like to open this question up to everyone, because I think everyone here has something very important to contribute to this part of the conversation. And perhaps Anouk, I'd like to start with you. Now that we've seen the results, what should we be watching for, and how should we assess this outcome?
Sure. Thank you so much for summarizing that, and thank you to all the panelists for the wonderful discussion. I think about the case this morning, for me personally, one thing that comes to mind is to continue to empathize and to be appalled by the situation in Hong Kong. I think it's easy for us to talk about, conspiracy to commit something and looking at these numbers and statistics. And I think I'm a big proponent of remembering the people that are actually there. I mean, there are 45 people that were sentenced today. They are 27 to 68 years old. They were Some of them were former lawmakers. I mean, people who wanted to represent us in Hong Kong. There were trade unionists, journalists, nurses. I mean, really normal people who wanted to make a genuine positive contribution to our home. And I think that's something that we should be supporting and admiring in most normal places. And to make their efforts a little bit more strategic in anticipation of the election, they decided to hold an unofficial primary, which was peaceful, well organized. I mean, I think that's something that we support. And the big crime that they've been accused of, you know, as a strategy to attempt to veto the government budget, in the US, that's called filibustering. And again, that is a peaceful political tool. And I think although the Hong Kong government will say, you know, these people have violated the national security law and the sentences have been thought through, they were reasonable, they absolutely are not. None of them should have been behind bars for a single day. They waited 3.5 years behind bars to get this sentence, and a sentence that is unfair for doing activities that we generally support in a vibrant, open society, and we want people to make efforts to improve our society and to represent the people, and we want people to be elected. And I want people who are elected to represent me and to be making active efforts to be engaged in government. And so I really urge people to look at all of their names, to read their stories, to think about what they actually wanted to achieve. You know, was it more participation? Was it inclusion of ethnic minorities? I mean, every candidate had their own agenda and their own story, and they will be serving time behind bars for peacefully trying to make our home a slightly better place. And I think that's really, really unjust. And I think that that is what the Hong Kong government wants to do. That and in looking at the rule of law in Hong Kong and the human rights landscape more broadly, we need to be remembering that there are actually people, individual stories and lives that were affected by this, and it was because they did not agree with the government. And this is the landscape that people are choosing to engage in, be it as a government or a business.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anouk. And you know, I want to continue this conversation and also point out that just tomorrow, you know, in addition to what we've seen today, Jimmy Lai, the founder of the now defunct newspaper Apple Daily, which had previously been one of the most prominent pro-democracy newspapers in Hong Kong, is perhaps one of the most high-profile national security law cases internationally. He currently faces 3 charges under the national security law, which carries a maximum punishment of life in prison, and 1 charge for conspiracy to publish seditious publications under the colonial-era sedition law. His libel suit began on the 18th of December in 2023, and it's set to resume tomorrow, November 20th, and will be processed by a single judge without a jury. And in many ways, this case has been viewed by the international legal and human rights communities as a poster child example of the demise of an independent judiciary in Hong Kong. So I'd love to bring that part of into our conversation with the Hong Kong 47 as well, to make sure that we address that as well. So Sophie, if I'd love to turn to you to discuss both, either both or all of this.
It's a tall order, Matt.
Yes.
Well, if I can just start where you left off, the fact that Jimmy Lai is being prosecuted for anything is horrific. And once again, I think it speaks to a point that my fellow panelists have made, that the people who are being prosecuted not only haven't broken laws, they are the people to pursue independent journalism, to make the legal system function. These are not just afterthoughts or niceties. These are essential laws and rights that have implications for the 7 million people in Hong Kong and globally. I mean, let's imagine whether the pandemic would have happened if the Chinese government had not been so reticent to share information, and if independent actors had been able to share that, the world might be a pretty different place. But I think some of the necessary fixes, require placing greater priority, democracies placing greater priority on the defense of human rights, in many cases at the expense of big businesses. I think unless and until that happens, we're not going to see much change. I find it grotesque that people are off doing business freely. People who get to go home and enjoy all sorts of rights when they go back to, New York or London or wherever, while they continue to make lots of money by doing business with people who've been sanctioned by their own governments. I am a big fan of the slow but hard work towards making, for example, the 2011 United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights more binding law. We do not place nearly as much human rights scrutiny as I think we should on investments. We've obviously seen some progress in recent years, at the cost of atrocity crimes being committed by the Chinese government against Uyghurs and other people in the mainland. We now have slightly better standards in some places about scrutiny of imports. I think we're still a long way away from a human rights basis for investment, both outbound investment and inbound. I think that should change to change the calculations of people like John Lee about what is and isn't acceptable behavior. But on the other side of the equation, I would like to see Democrats with a small d regularly embracing and talking about their analogs in places like Hong Kong. I forget who it was the other day who posted on social media a picture of President Biden shaking hands with a senior Taiwanese government official on the margins of APEC. This is sort of considered a little bit scandalous, sort of higher level recognition. Nobody should be shy about that, right? Not only should democracies embrace other democracies, they should be actively seeking out and defending democrats. So again, the statements that governments will have issued condemning this outcome this morning, yeah, okay, you can use ChatGPT to write those things these days. What I think needs to happen is that the senior most officials of democracies have to be talking publicly about some of the kinds of people, and literally the people who were sentenced this morning, right? You want to put John Lee and Xi Jinping on notice that they're not the only game in town. Recognize those people, ask for their views, defend them, demand their releases, and put something meaningful on the line to do so. I don't see why we won't still be having the same conversation 25 years from now as we're having 25 years ago, unless democracies and people in them are willing to make those kinds of changes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sophie. And those are really, really key points and pivotal points. Kevin, I'd like to turn to you to offer your own thoughts on this, and Tom as well. And before we close out, we want to get to another one or two couple points. But since this is such a worthy subject, I don't want to leave it just yet.
Thank you very much. First of all, the sentencing today is, for me, not just political, it's also personal. So Benny Tai, who got jailed for 10 years, he was my co-author in my first ever academic journal paper over 20 years ago. A number of others were people that I campaigned for in previous elections. One of them was even a sort of semi-neighbor living in my neighborhood. And another, Leung Kwok Hong, famous for his long hair, and I shared a passion for whiskey. So to see these people who I counted as not just colleagues, but friends for many years, languishing like this is just devastating. But I guess on the point about judicial independence, I often get asked this, and people seem to have this idea of judicial independence or the lack of it being a narrow thing of, oh, the judges being told how they should rule. But in some ways, I suspect the situation in Hong Kong is a little bit more insidious than that. It's more that I actually think China is cleverer than going around tapping judges on the shoulder, telling them this is how you must rule. I think it is much more that they've created an environment where when judges rule the wrong way, you've got the Chinese State Council putting out statements lambasting them. Where judges that fall into line get promoted, judges that don't fall into line get moved away from certain types of cases. And when you create a whole atmosphere like that, judges are human, they don't live in a vacuum. It's very easy to rationalize and condition yourself into believing that you're independently reaching these so-called right outcomes from the perspective of the authorities. And so in many ways, that's actually even more insidious than them being told what to do. Now, turning to the case of the 47 itself also, the other thing that I got asked a lot by journalists today was, was the sentencing in line with what I expected? Was it better or worse? And my reply to them is always, don't get into that, because by even getting into the question of whether the sentencing was in line with what's been expected, is to suggest that there is some baseline of reasonableness in terms of how long you put these people in jail for, when in fact even 1 second is too long when it comes to putting them in jail, especially when you consider that what they're being accused of, which as Anouk said, is essentially filibuster. And I would add that the Hong Kong Basic Law actually provides for what to do when there's filibuster happening and how to resolve differences between the legislature and the executive government. And so these are people who are not trying to revolt against the regime. These are people who are trying to work within the system, and they're being convicted for that. And the most ridiculous case is one involving Gordon, an Australian citizen. He got 7 years and 3 months, essentially for running a Facebook page, encouraging people to vote in this informal primary. I mean, really? I mean, running a Facebook page like that, 7 years, 3 months? I mean, as John McEnroe might say, you cannot be serious, right? So, yeah, it's just devastating stuff today. And for me anyway, I haven't been okay all day, and I'm sure it's the same with a lot of you too.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And again, I truly cannot imagine what you're going through, but of course your colleagues and everyone is connected to in this situation. So Tom, I want to make sure that you have a moment to touch on this issue as well before we move on. We're going to extend another few minutes past 10, so I hope our audience can stick around for a little bit as well. And Kevin, of course, especially with the late hour for you, definitely appreciate that as well.
Yeah, just quickly on the sentencing, it's sadly no surprise that no one walks out today. Right, that the courts made sure to deliver sentences, that extended beyond the already ridiculously long pretrial detention that the vast majority of the 45 have endured. And I mention that because it speaks to what I think is almost certainly a political calculus that the judges are engaging in, right? They're making decisions based on what they think Beijing will be okay with, right, as Kevin sort of alluded to. And they knew they had to drop the hammer on Benny Tai and a couple of other key, quote unquote, ringleader defendants, and they did that. But then for for the entirety of everyone else, they made sure to deliver verdicts that were a minimum of 4 years, so that there would be no happy moment of a person finally getting to walk free. And I think in particular here of Claudia Moore, excuse me, whose husband has been quite ill for some time. And the fact that even someone like her is not able to walk free today speaks volumes about the kind of cowering political calculus that the courts are engaged in, which is deeply sad. One final quick point on this. I actually want to say one word on the verdict itself, going back a couple months, and how deeply embarrassing that verdict is. The quality of it is just beyond bad. There's no serious human rights analysis. It's not persuasive to any reader in any way. I don't even think that pro-government voices would find it persuasive or illuminating, given their different point of view. And that speaks to some of the structural problems and dynamic that Kevin was alluding to in his opening remarks, right? You're just going to see this continued institutional deterioration as the courts are forced to deliver low quality verdicts like this, and then follow it up with draconian sentences of the sort that we saw today. So I think, again, the prospects going forward for human rights and rule of law in Hong Kong are quite serious.
Thanks so much, Tom. So we are running up on time, and we haven't had a moment to even address the incoming elephant in the room. We will be entering the second term of Donald Trump. And, I just wanted to see if we could get some just quick thoughts before we close out on how we would assess what's to come based on what we saw during his first administration. And of course, he also recently announced his appointment for Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and the implications of what that means as well. Of course, during the first Trump administration, the Hong Kong Human Rights Act and Human Rights and Democracy Act and the Hong Kong Autonomy Act were both signed into law. We've also seen the expansion or the continuation, although we're still wondering what may come with the potential end of the deferred enforced departure of Hong Kongers who are living in the United States. So just any quick thoughts on what we might see for the next administration on how they might handle the continued issues that we're seeing in Hong Kong. So Anouk, start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I think President Trump has made a lot of strong claims about human rights in Hong Kong. He recently said that Jimmy Lai should be free, but he's made a lot of claims about the Chinese Communist Party and what they're doing, not just in Hong Kong, but also in China. So we'll be following up on that and doing our best to call for concrete action following these claims. And we really hope that he will indeed be able to follow through. We're enthusiastic about the appointment of Senator Marco Rubio as the new Secretary of State. He's been a long-standing ally of the Hong Kong community. He's extremely knowledgeable, and he has been extremely supportive of Hong Kongers, and so we hope that he will also take more concrete action to support Hong Kongers and human rights in China more broadly. And we hope to work with his team when the new administration begins.
Thanks so much, Anouk. And unfortunately, I'm being told that we are at time. So I just want to thank everyone again, Anouk, Kevin, Sophie, and Tom. And congratulations again, Anouk, for such a wonderful report. It will be posted online shortly after this event concludes. And really looking forward to seeing what comes next. And thanks again to everyone.
Thank you so much.